Jeanne was the illegitimate daughter of a monk and a cook, and she was destined for a life among the lower-class people. Her mother raised her alone while working for a kind man who took them in and allowed them to stay with him. He welcomed Jeanne into his circle and even fueled her thirst for knowledge. Soon after, he paid for her to join a monastery to protect her from the harsh world, where young girls like her often turned to fornication. At the monastery, Jeanne grew up and realized that life wasn't for her. She found comfort in books, but one day she stumbled upon an erotic book and was caught reading it by the river. The head of the monastery branded her a child of Satan and sent her away. Her mother and the kind man who had sheltered them came to take her back after she was expelled. Back at home, Jeanne continued her fond relationship with the kind man until one day his wife became worried that her husband wouldn't be able to resist Jeanne, who had grown into an attractive young woman. The wife framed Jeanne and her mother for stealing and used it as an excuse to drive them out. Jeanne and her mother then made their way to Paris to start a new life. In Paris, Jeanne met an old rich widow with 2 sons and became her reader. Over time, Jeanne was educated enough to stand on an equal level with members of high society. However, she was later driven from the widow's house after it was discovered that she had slept with both sons. Still, Jeanne realized that she could be a free woman in this type of society. Years passed, and she learned how to use her beauty and charms to lure rich and powerful men. At an exotic villa, Jeanne met a wealthy man named Du Barry, who immediately fell for her and took her in. While living with him, she became an attraction for his rich and influential guests, one of whom was a duke. The duke saw her and was immediately charmed. Later, he asked Du Barry to send Jeanne to the king, arranging it so it looked like a chance meeting. Du Barry told Jeanne about the plan, but she initially chose to stay because she cared for his son. Eventually, he convinced her, and she met the duke. The duke offered her a chance to change her life by being introduced to the king. He asked her what kind of life she wanted, and Jeanne replied that she didn't want to end up like her mother, a cook. They agreed, and the duke seduced her. At the palace, Jeanne stood in line with the other royals. As the king made his entrance, their plan worked. The king stopped and noticed her immediately, captivated by her beauty. Later, one of the king's aides came to Jeanne's home to announce that the king wished to see her immediately. The aide paid her a hefty sum, and Jeanne, despite the short notice, agreed to go. She was given a black robe to conceal herself on the way to the palace. At the palace, Jeanne was examined and questioned about any illnesses, but she passed the test. Then, the king's aide instructed her on how to behave with the king. Amused by her attitude, the king welcomed her. He asked her to let her hair loose, and they soon became intimate. The next morning, Jeanne was taken to a secret room where she observed the king's daily activities. The king kept glancing toward her, clearly entertained by her presence. He later gave her a necklace and asked her to stay with him. Jeanne accepted. Time passed, and Jeanne became more secure in her position with the king. She was eventually married off in a quiet ceremony to Du Barry, arranged by the king's aide in order to legitimize her place at court. After the wedding, Jeanne was formally introduced to the palace society. Despite strict instructions about etiquette, Jeanne often behaved boldly and with humor, which both shocked and fascinated the court. One day at dinner, the king presented her with an unusual gift, a young African boy named Zamor. Though the gesture startled many, Jeanne took him under her care. She and Zamor grew close, and they were given their own place and servants in the palace. Jeanne loved her new life, though she faced constant ridicule from the king's daughters and members of the court. Despite opposition, Jeanne remained the king's favorite. She built a life of comfort and influence. With Zamor always by her side, she shocked people with her unconventional behavior, such as dressing as a man during outings, but she was adored by the king nonetheless. Over the years, Jeanne's bond with the king deepened. Eventually, however, tragedy struck. The king fell ill, and Jeanne's glittering world began to darken. He was seen by various doctors, and they soon determined that he had contracted smallpox. The king's aide informed Jeanne, who looked saddened. She asked if the king knew, but the aide replied that if he did, the shock would kill him. He also warned her that if the king died, she would be in danger because the royal family would chase her away. Later, the heir and his fiancée, Nari, tried to meet with the king, but they were turned away by the aide since the disease was contagious. The heir insisted that he wanted to see his grandfather, but they still refused. Eventually, the king's children all knelt at his bedside, including Marie, covering their noses as they prayed. The king's aide was also present when he noticed the bumps on the king's face. The king quickly asked for his mirror, but they hesitated, not wanting him to discover the truth. Still, the aide reluctantly handed it over. Once the king saw his reflection, despair overcame him. Knowing his time was short, he ordered that the candle be lit, a sign to all that the king was gravely ill and would soon die. When the candle was placed on the balcony, the news spread and his children wept. Realizing her own time at court was ending, Jeanne went to her room and began packing all her belongings, including the special ring the king had given her. Her aides and servants loaded boxes of clothes into a carriage. As she prepared to leave, the royal family muttered with relief at her departure. But suddenly, Jeanne turned back and ran toward the palace. At the entrance to the king's chambers, she begged to be let in to say goodbye. The royals refused, insisting she had already taken her leave. Fortunately, the heir to the throne spoke up and ordered them to allow her inside. In the chamber, Jeanne broke into tears and held the king one final time. At last, she confessed that she loved him. The king smiled and told her she had finally said it for the first time. As they parted, Jeanne playfully mimicked the way the aide had once taught her to exit the king's presence without turning her back. She smiled, then covered his face gently. Outside, she bowed to the heir who had always treated her kindly and thanked him. At the carriage, Jeanne said goodbye to her family and finally embraced the king's aide, one of her truest friends. He too wept as she departed. Meanwhile, the king spent his final moments with holy men, renouncing his scandals so that his soul might be cleansed. Beside him was his old friend and his loyal aide. He thanked them both, calling the aide his friend, words that brought the man to tears once again. Moments later, the aide noticed the king had fallen silent. Placing his hand over the king's mouth, he realized the king had passed. Somberly, he rose and announced the death to the royal family, who collapsed in grief. The ceremonial candle was then extinguished on the balcony, signaling to all that the king was gone. The people below bowed, removed their hats, and paid their respects. An announcer declared the king's death before switching his hat and proclaiming, "Long live the king." At once, the crowds rushed to the heir, who was now King of France. He and his wife, Marie, prayed as members of the court bowed before them. The aide returned to the king's chambers and sat beside his departed friend one last time. As for Jeanne, she went back to the monastery with her attendants and envoys. She was allowed entry only after being given a cup of water, a symbolic gesture of forgiveness. Yet because of her scandal, she was imprisoned there for 1 year. If you want to find out, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you on the next video.